Chapter 1: The Christmas I Kept Alive. Everyone smiled at my Christmas table. My husband poured wine, my cousin laughed, my mother-in-law talked about family. What they did not know was that I had already seen the debt, the lies, and the plan they made without me. My name is Marianne Holt, and this is the story of the moment I stopped keeping the peace and started keeping the truth. I have always been the one who keeps things moving, not because I enjoy control, but because I know what happens when I let go. Conversations stall, tempers surface, small cracks widen into something no one wants to clean up. In our family, if the rhythm holds, it is usually because I am quietly counting the beats. That Christmas in 2024 was no different. I woke up before anyone else in our house in the northern suburbs of Chicago. The sky still dim, the neighborhood quiet in that rare way it only is on holiday mornings. I moved through the kitchen on instinct, starting the coffee, setting out the dishes I knew Lydia preferred, checking the oven even though nothing was in it yet. These were not acts of love so much as acts of prevention. Our house looked exactly the way it was supposed to: familiar, comfortable, predictable. That was the point. Christmas did not need to be impressive, it needed to feel stable. Stability was what everyone came for, whether they admitted it or not. Ethan came downstairs while I was arranging the place settings. He kissed my cheek, light and quick, and asked if I had slept well. His voice was calm, reassuring, the same tone he used with clients when he wanted them to trust him. Ethan Holt, 43, financial consultant, self-employed, professional optimizer of other people's anxiety. At home, he specialized in the appearance of steadiness. "Everything ready?" he asked, glancing around the room. "Almost," I said. "I just need to start dinner." He nodded and reached for his phone, already half turned away. I noticed, not for the first time, that he never asked what time anything needed to be done. He trusted that I had it handled, or assumed it. Clara arrived just after noon, as she always did, letting herself in through the side door without knocking. She carried a box of pastries from a bakery I liked, and smiled like someone who belonged exactly where she was. Clara Bennett, 38, events planner, my cousin by marriage if you trace the line carefully enough. She had been part of our holidays for years now, so familiar that her presence no longer registered as something to question. "You look tired," she said, setting the box down and touching my arm. "Did you sleep at all?" I smiled and shrugged. "Holidays." She laughed softly, already moving toward the living room, already at ease in my space. She knew where we kept the extra napkins, where the good glasses were stored, which drawer stuck if you did not pull it just right. I told myself that was what family did. They settled in, they relaxed, they made themselves at home. Ethan arrived last, precisely on time. Ethan's mother never rushed and never waited. She greeted Ethan first, then me, her embrace firm and lingering just long enough to remind me that she was assessing something. Marianne Holt, 67, retired, sharp-eyed, deeply invested in the idea that family survived because women learned when to bend. The house filled with the sounds I had worked to assemble: plates clinking, low conversation, the television murmuring softly in the background. I moved between the kitchen and dining room, checking on everyone, refilling glasses, smoothing over the smallest moments of friction before they could grow teeth. At one point, Lydia caught my wrist gently as I passed by. "You should sit," she said. "You do too much. A woman who wants peace has to learn when to be still." I smiled again, the automatic one, and promised I would sit soon. Dinner began the way it always did: polite, controlled. Ethan talked about work in vague terms, the kinds of projects that sounded impressive without revealing anything measurable. Clara asked questions, engaged in the way people do when they want to be seen as supportive. Lydia commented on how good everything tasted and how nice it was that we could all be together. I watched them more than I spoke. I had learned over the years that listening gave me more information than filling silence ever did. It happens when Lydia mentioned next year. Not anything specific, just a passing comment about how things would be different soon, how plans had a way of unfolding whether you were ready or not. "We should think ahead," she said, looking from Ethan to me. "Next year comes faster than you expect." Ethan nodded. Clara did too. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, quick and practiced, like a signal exchanged without words. It was not dramatic. No one froze, no one went quiet, but it was there. I felt it before I understood it, a tightening in my chest, the sense that I had walked into a room where a conversation had just ended. When I looked up, they were already looking away. Clara reached for her water. Ethan cleared his throat and asked if Lydia wanted more bread. The moment dissolved as easily as it had formed. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they didn't react. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was tired, that hosting had sharpened my nerves. I reminded myself that Christmas was not the time for suspicion, it was the time for grace. The rest of the meal passed without incident. Dessert was served, compliments were exchanged. Lydia repeated her familiar refrain about how important it was to protect what you had built. Ethan smiled. Clara laughed. I kept moving, kept the rhythm steady, kept the peace intact. Later, when the plates were cleared and the house had settled into that heavy quiet that follows too much food and forced cheer, I stood alone in the kitchen and stared at the sink. My reflection in the dark window looked older than I remembered, tired in a way sleep didn't fix. Ethan wrapped his arms around me from behind. "You did great. Everyone was happy." I nodded, leaning into him just enough to look convincing. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I lay awake listening to the house settle. Pipes clicking, heat humming, the familiar sounds of a life that, from the outside, looked whole. I thought about that glance again, how natural it had been, how unremarkable, how easy it would be to miss if you were already used to carrying the weight of everything else. I told myself I was reading into nothing, that families were complicated, that trust meant choosing calm over curiosity. Christmas was supposed to be peaceful, and I had spent years learning how to make peace look effortless. So, I let it go. It felt easier to believe that than to ask myself why, for the first time in a long while, the rhythm I kept so carefully no longer felt like my own. Chapter 2. The doubts I couldn't ignore. Something stayed unsettled after the holiday ended, even as the house returned to its usual schedule. The decorations came down, the leftovers disappeared, work emails resumed. From the outside, life clicked back into place. Inside me, it did not. I started noticing things I had trained myself not to notice before. Not dramatic changes, small shifts. The kind that only stand out when you stop telling yourself they are normal. Ethan began taking more calls outside. He said it was easier to hear clients in the cold air, that the walls inside carried sound. Sometimes he stepped into the garage, sometimes onto the back porch, even when the temperature dropped below freezing. I would watch him through the kitchen window, his shoulders angled away from the house, his voice low and steady. When he came back in, his face looked the same as always, relaxed, reassuring, like nothing important had happened. One evening, I asked him, gently, if we should review our joint account before the end of the year. Not because I suspected anything, I told myself, but because it was practical, because we always did. He smiled and told me there was nothing to worry about. He said he had everything under control. He said it in the same tone he used with clients when they panicked over numbers they did not understand. Calm, confident, vague. I waited for details. They never came. Clara started showing up more often after Christmas, always with a reason that sounded thoughtful. She wanted to keep Lydia company. She did not want her aunt feeling lonely after the holidays. She happened to be in the neighborhood. It made sense. Too much sense. What unsettled me was how precisely she knew my schedule. She would arrive just after I left for work or leave 10 minutes before I got home. When I mentioned it once, lightly, she laughed and said she must have good timing. I laughed too, because that was easier than asking how she knew. At night, when the house was quiet, memories began arranging themselves differently. Between 2019 and 2022, Ethan had talked often about short-term investments, opportunities that required flexibility, temporary tightness that would pay off later. I remembered nodding while folding laundry, answering emails, planning the next week. I remembered thinking that trusting him was part of being a good partner, that money was his language, not mine. Back then, it felt like respect. Now, it felt like absence. I met Naomi for coffee on a gray Wednesday afternoon near my office downtown. We had known each other for years, long enough to speak without performance. She worked in human resources and had seen the quiet ways lives unraveled. I told her I felt off, that something at home did not sit right. She did not ask for details. She did not tell me what to do. She asked me one question. She asked if I still felt safe inside my own life. The word landed harder than I expected. Safe. Not happy, not loved. Safe. I did not answer right away. That night, I came home later than usual. Ethan was not there. He had left a note on the counter saying he would be back soon. I reheated leftovers and ate standing up, scrolling through my phone without reading anything. When I finished, I reached for a dish towel and noticed something out of place. A stack of papers sat on the corner of the kitchen table. Not mail, not work notes. Printed documents slightly askew, as if someone had meant to gather them but stopped halfway. I should have walked past them. I knew that even then. Instead, I picked them up. They were bank statements, an account I did not recognize, in Ethan's name only, page after page of transactions, balances that did not reset to zero, numbers that told a story without needing interpretation. Debt. Not recent, not accidental, years of it. My first reaction was not anger, it was distance, the strange sensation of watching something important happen to someone else. I sat down slowly, the papers still in my hands, and tried to understand how something this large had existed alongside me without touching me at all. When Ethan came home, I heard his keys at the door. I placed the papers back exactly where I found them. I did not confront him. I did not ask questions. I did not give him the chance to offer an explanation shaped to fit my expression. We ate dessert together in silence. He talked about a client meeting scheduled for the following week. I nodded. I listened. I matched his calm. Later, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about how many decisions had been made without me. Not just about money, about direction, about risk, about what our marriage meant when one person carried information the other never had access to. I realized then that the most painful part was not the debt itself. It was the understanding that I had been excluded from the truth for a long time. Not protected, not spared, excluded. I could have asked him that night. I could have demanded answers. Instead, I chose something quieter. I chose to wait. Not because I was afraid of what he would say, but because I was no longer willing to accept the first version of the truth that made me easiest to manage. Chapter 3. Silence became my advantage. What changed after that night was not my expression or my tone, but my attention. I stayed quiet on purpose, not the kind of silence that shrinks, but the kind that watches. I stopped filling gaps. I stopped smoothing edges. I started listening for patterns instead of excuses. Ethan left the house at the same times every week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, just after dinner. He said it was for client calls that required privacy. Clara's visits followed a rhythm too. She showed up on the days I worked late and left just before I returned. I wrote nothing down. I did not need to. The repetition made its own record. When Ethan talked about money, I noticed how often he used general language. He said things like, "Everything is handled," or "We are fine for now." He never said numbers. He never said dates. When I nodded, he relaxed. When I asked nothing, he assumed I knew nothing. I scheduled a lunch meeting with Paul Reynolds the following week. Paul was 55 now, older than when he helped me close on our house in 2015, but unchanged in the ways that mattered: direct, methodical, uninterested in drama. His office downtown looked exactly the same as it had years earlier. Neutral walls, clean desk, no distractions. I told him I wanted to review my financial position. I did not say why. He did not ask. We went through everything piece by piece: the house, the retirement accounts, the legal documents I had signed when I was promoted in 2018. Paul slid papers across the table and explained what they meant in plain language. "You have more authority here than you think," he said at one point, tapping the page lightly. "This structure gives you final say." I blinked. Final say over what? "Over assets tied to your employment and long-term planning," he replied. "Your husband does not override that." The realization did not come with relief. It came with clarity. Ethan had been operating under an assumption. That assumption was wrong. "Does he know this?" I asked. Paul shook his head. "Most people do not read these sections closely. They focus on income, not control." I left his office with copies of everything that mattered and a quiet understanding that the ground beneath me was not as unstable as I had been led to believe. At home, Lydia noticed the change in me before anyone else did. She always did. She cornered me in the kitchen one afternoon while I was chopping vegetables. "You seem distant," she said. "Is something wrong between you and Ethan?" I kept my voice even. "Nothing that needs discussing." She frowned. "Families fall apart when women stop protecting them." "I am not trying to make anything fall apart," I said. "Then do not stir things up," she replied. "Silence can be a virtue." I almost smiled at that. Almost. The night I heard them talking was accidental, or maybe it only felt that way because I was ready to hear it. I had gone upstairs to change and realized I left my phone in the living room. As I came back down, I stopped on the stairs when I heard my name. "She will not push back," Clara said. Her voice was low, confident. Ethan answered without hesitation. "She never does." "Are you sure?" Clara asked. "Marianne always chooses calm. She would rather hold things together than confront anything." There was a pause. Then Clara laughed softly. "That works in our favor," she said. I stood still until the conversation shifted. When I finally stepped into the room, they looked up at me without guilt, without fear, without any sense that they had miscalculated. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked. "Fine," I said. Later that night, I lay awake replaying that moment. Not the words themselves, but the certainty behind them. They were not worried about my reaction. They were not preparing for conflict. They believed my silence was permanent. That belief was the most dangerous thing in the room. Over the next few days, I made small decisions quietly. I moved copies of documents to a secure place. I adjusted access settings on accounts tied to my work. I stopped answering questions about money with reassurance and started answering with neutrality. When Ethan asked once if I was stressed, I said no. When Clara offered to help with errands, I declined politely. When Lydia reminded me again that peace required sacrifice, I nodded and changed the subject. None of them noticed the shift because it did not look like resistance. It looked like compliance. Inside, something settled into place. Not anger, not revenge, resolve. I understood then that they did not fear my anger. They feared disruption, and they had built their plans on the assumption that I would never be the source of it. They were wrong. For the first time since this began, I was not reacting. I was deciding. And once I saw how small their certainty made me in their eyes, I knew exactly what needed to end. Chapter 4. When they thought I was oblivious. By the time January settled in, Ethan no longer bothered hiding his confidence. It showed in the way he spoke to me, slower and louder, as if repetition might replace explanation. He stopped asking for my opinion entirely and started informing me instead. One evening, he mentioned casually that he was thinking about restructuring a few things after the new year. "It will make everything smoother," he said, scrolling on his phone, "less pressure on both of us." I asked what he meant by smoother. He smiled, the same practiced smile he used when he thought he was calming someone down. "Just logistics," he said. "Nothing you need to worry about." The words landed exactly as he intended, dismissive but gentle enough to sound kind. I nodded, like I always had, and he relaxed instantly. It confirmed what I already knew. He believed the role I played was permanent. Clara chose her moments carefully. She invited me out for coffee on a Saturday morning, just the two of us, framing it as concern. "You have been carrying a lot," she said, once we sat down. "Anyone would feel overwhelmed." "I am fine," I replied. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I just hate seeing tension in the family," she said. "Ethan is under so much stress. You know how he is with responsibility." I waited. She slid a folder across the table, casual but deliberate. "These are just forms," she said. "Nothing major. They would give Ethan some flexibility while things settle. Temporary." I opened the folder. The language was dense, but familiar enough to recognize intent. It shifted authority, quietly, permanently. I looked up at her. "Who asked you to bring this to me?" I said. She did not hesitate. I offered. That was the moment it became clear. Clara was not just aware of the situation, she was managing it, actively steering me towards smaller space. "You trust him, right? This is just paperwork." I closed the folder and slid it back to her. "I will think about it," I said. Her smile tightened. "Of course." That afternoon, I called Paul again. This time, there was no pretense of review. "I need to lock things down," I said. We met 2 days later. We moved quickly. Paul prepared documentation that reinforced my authority over assets tied to my work. He outlined options if I chose to end the marriage. Clean, legal, precise. "You do not have to decide today," he said, "but you should be prepared." I was. Naomi and I spoke later that week. She told me about a woman at her company who had trusted silence for too long. She thought keeping the peace meant staying safe. By the time she spoke up, there was nothing left to protect. That story stayed with me. At a family dinner not long after, Lydia mentioned something that finally confirmed everything. "Ethan says things will be much better after the first quarter," she said brightly. "He promised there would be money to help everyone." Ethan stiffened for a half second before covering it. "We are exploring options," he said. I knew then that the promise was built on assumption, not reality. That night, alone in our bedroom, I made my decision. Not in anger, not in grief, in clarity. I sent a message to everyone the next morning. "I would like us to sit down together soon. Just family, no occasion." No one objected. They did not see it coming, and that was exactly why it would work. Chapter 5. The moment the smiles failed. The room felt different once everyone arrived, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with courtesy. We sat around the dining table where we had shared so many holidays, but there was no food this time, no pretense of celebration. Just chairs pulled close and space left deliberately empty. I did not rush. I waited until everyone settled, until the small movements stopped, until eyes lifted toward me, expecting an explanation or perhaps an apology. "I wanted us to talk while everything is clear," I said. My voice surprised even me with how steady it sounded. "No interruptions, no guessing." Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, confident in a way that once would have unnerved me. Clara sat beside him, posture careful, hands folded. Lydia watched me closely, already preparing to manage whatever she thought was coming. I began with facts, not feelings. I placed the papers on the table, one set at a time. "These are the statements from the account in your name," I said to Ethan. the one you never mentioned. The debt did not start recently. It spans years." He frowned and waved a hand dismissively. "You are misunderstanding," he said. "Those numbers do not mean what you think they mean." I nodded. "I thought you might say that," I replied, sliding the next document forward. "This shows the transfers between that account and the ones tied to our household expenses." His confidence shifted, just slightly. Clara leaned in then, her voice quick and soothing. "She is overwhelmed," she said to Lydia. "We all know how stress can distort things." I looked at Clara. "You knew about this," I said calmly. "You knew and you helped keep it from me." Her smile faltered. "I was trying to help," she said. "Ethan was under pressure. I thought protecting you from worry was kinder." "Kinder for whom?" I asked. Ethan's voice rose. "This is not fair," he said. "You are making it sound worse than it is." I waited for him to finish. Then I slid the final document across the table. "These are the agreements tied to my employment," I said. "They establish authority over assets you assumed were shared." He stared at the paper without touching it. "That cannot be right," he said. "It is," I replied. "You did not read the sections that mattered." Silence settled over the table, not the awkward kind, but the heavy kind that forces reckoning. Clara spoke again, softer now. "I did not gain anything from this," she said. "That is not true," I replied. "You stood to gain stability at my expense, access, influence." She looked away. Lydia's hands trembled as she clasped them together. "All this time, you told me keeping peace meant staying quiet." I met her eyes. "Peace built on silence is not peace. It is permission." Finally, Ethan lowered his arms. The posture of control dissolved into something smaller. "What do you want?" he asked. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. "I am ending this marriage, not out of anger, but because trust does not survive exclusion. I am also setting boundaries with anyone who believed my silence was consent." No one argued. There was nothing left to argue with. The consequences did not explode outward. They settled in quietly. Ethan faced the reality of obligations he could no longer hide behind me. Clara lost the position of influence she had assumed would remain invisible. Lydia sat with the understanding that her advice, however well-intentioned, had protected the wrong things. When everyone left, the house was quiet again. Not the forced quiet of endurance, but the calm that follows truth. That Christmas did not end with laughter or reconciliation. It ended with something rarer: safety. If you have ever found yourself shrinking to keep others comfortable, I want you to know this: taking your power back does not require cruelty. It requires clarity. And if this story resonated with you, stay. There are more truths worth telling, and you are not alone in listening.